It's been more than a week since India's Chandrayaan-3 mission landed on the Moon, and it's a good time to assess where the world's most populous nation stands relative to other global space powers. The successful arrival of the Chandrayaan-3 mission's Vikram lander on the Moon made India the first country besides China to achieve a soft landing on the lunar surface since 1976. Following a series of failed landings by private organizations and India itself 4 years ago. And it made India just the fourth nation overall to achieve this feat. Since the landing of Chandrayaan-3 on August 23, India has released some early findings from the lander and its mobile rover, named Pragyan, along with photos of the vehicles exploring the Moon's alien charcoal color landscape. If India can notch another success in its space program in the next few years, the country could become the fourth nation capable of sending its astronauts into low Earth orbit. India is still well behind the space programs of the United States and China. But one could argue India has moved closer to Europe and Russia and could be on par with Japan when you take into account several factors. Access to space, space exploration, military space projects, and applications like communications, navigation, and remote sensing from orbit. Among the space powers considered here, India has the lowest Human Development Index, a measure of social factors such as quality of life, income, and education. But its space program is a point of national pride, and Narendra Modi, India's nationalist Prime Minister, has made a point to associate himself with Indian successes in space. Those successes have come on a shoestring budget. The Indian government this year is allocating $1.52 billion to space efforts, and India developed and launched Chandrayaan-3 for less than $100 million. Lower than the cost of many blockbuster Hollywood films. Since the landing of Chandrayaan-3, the Indian Space Research Organisation, ISRO, India's space agency has released a handful of images, including a black and white shot of the stationary SUV-size Vikram lander taken by the Pragyan rover. There's also a video, shown below, of the Pragyan rover rolling down the ramp from the Vikram lander in the hours after arriving on the Moon on August 23. So far, ISRO hasn't been releasing all of the pictures taken by the rover and lander on the Moon, and the Indian Space Agency hasn't posted many images on its website, preferring to share them on social media. Let's hope Indian officials develop a better way of releasing high-resolution imagery from Chandrayaan-3 and future deep space probes. Taking India seriously. The landing follows several decades of serious growth in India's accomplishments in space. India launched a small satellite into low Earth orbit with an indigenous rocket for the first time in 1980. It then debuted the workhorse Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle in 1993. India's orbital-class rockets only flew about 1 time per year until the early 2000s. Since then, India has ramped up its launch rate, reaching 7 orbital flights on a couple of occasions, an annual record that India is poised to shatter this year. The country has launched its rockets 6 times so far in 2023, with a 7th launch scheduled for Saturday. Those recent launch statistics fall far behind the United States, China, and Russia. In terms of mass launched into orbit, ISRO ranked 4th among global launch providers in the first half of this year, after SpaceX, China's state-run launch enterprises, and Russia's space agency. India's expendable rockets have notched 54 successful launches in 57 tries since 2011, a success rate of nearly 95%, about the same as all European and Japanese rockets and slightly better than Russian launch vehicles in the same period. India's 95% success rate falls short of the reliability of U.S. launch companies SpaceX and United Launch Alliance and also lags behind China's Long March rocket family. India's launch vehicles are regularly used to deploy the country's satellites and payloads from international and commercial customers. When OneWeb could no longer launch its internet satellites on Russian rockets after the invasion of Ukraine, the company selected SpaceX and India's heaviest rocket, the LVM-3, to finish launching the broadband network. ISRO recently started an initiative to commercialize its rockets by turning over responsibility for manufacturing and launch operations to the private sector. Launch is just one way of assessing the standing of India's space program on the global stage. India has dispatched robotic missions to orbit Mars, orbit the Moon, and now land on the Moon, vaulting ISRO into an exclusive club of space agencies. These achievements in planetary science are comparable to those of the European Space Agency and JAXA, Japan's space agency. Although those space agencies haven't landed on the Moon, and Japan hasn't had a successful mission to Mars, ESA and JAXA have had more success in sending probes to comets and asteroids. In this area, India is indisputably ahead of Russia in terms of recent accomplishments. Russia hasn't had a successful mission to another celestial body since the Soviet era in the 1980s. India and Japan are working together on a future robotic lunar landing mission that could launch in the late 2020s. And India in June signed on to the Artemis Accords, a non-binding set of principles among like-minded nations guiding a vision for peaceful and transparent exploration of space. The Artemis Accords were developed by the United States, and the signing raised questions about future Indian partnership with NASA's Artemis lunar program, although U.S. and Indian officials haven't laid out any details of potential cooperation. Next year, an Indian rocket will send a sophisticated radar satellite into orbit in partnership with NASA to measure minute changes on Earth's surface. Then there is the proliferation of Indian satellites circling Earth, ranging from television broadcast satellites to sharp-eyed reconnaissance spacecraft feeding data to India's military. India also has a network of satellites providing navigation services over South Asia, a similar regional capability to one that Japan has deployed over the last decade. The United States, China, and Russia each have their own satellite networks for global navigation services. Where is India lagging? Barring any significant delays, India is a few years away from truly entering the uppermost echelons of the world's space powers. The $1.1 billion Gaganyaan program has been a priority of Prime Minister Modi, who announced in 2018 that the new Indian-made space capsule would carry an Indian astronaut into orbit by 2022. That timetable has come and gone, and the first crewed flight of the Gaganyaan spacecraft is now projected to occur no earlier than 2025. But some big milestones are on the horizon, with a high-altitude test of the Gaganyaan launch abort system planned as soon as late September or early October. An on-pad test of the abort system occurred in 2018. An orbital test flight of the Gaganyaan spacecraft without any crew members aboard could launch in 2024, setting the stage for the astronaut flight in 2025. As a prelude to the Gaganyaan program, NASA and ISRO have agreed to train Indian astronauts at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And an Indian crew member will fly to the International Space Station next year on a short-duration mission. 4 Indian astronauts slated for the Gaganyaan program completed more than a year of training at Russia's Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center near Moscow in 2021, according to Indian media. India is human-rating its LVM-3 rocket, with 2 powerful solid rocket boosters and a liquid-fueled core stage, to haul the Gaganyaan spacecraft into orbit. The capsule is designed to accommodate a crew of 3 astronauts for missions lasting up to 1 week. If India successfully establishes a sustainable human spaceflight program, then it may be time to re-evaluate India's ranking relative to Russia among spacefaring nations. Despite Russia's languishing record in deep space exploration, its prowess in human spaceflight continues to make Russia's space program a global leader.